I'm here with Carrie Gress, who's written a new book, The End of Woman. Tell us a little thumbnail sketch about your book.
Yeah, so this book really was written in reaction to the fact that we can't really define what a woman is anymore in the culture. That famous Matt Walsh question.
Right.
But I think that, I'd already been looking at feminism and trying to pinpoint really where the problems were and where it started. And anyway, I realized that I hadn't spent enough time looking at first wave feminism, and I thought, let me just go back, check the box, make sure everything looks good. Maybe I'll find some nice quotes and things like that I can pull from it. And
the time period for first wave feminism.
First wave is like 1790s roughly until about the early 1960s. So it's a big chunk of time.
Yeah.
You've got suffrage movement in there. And anyway, so the book really is a look at what I found in the first wave, which was absolutely shocking to me. I thought I would spend like 2 days looking at the first wave, and it was more like 3 months, just a very focused work. So basically, the idea is that starting to pull out what are the major pieces in feminism we can see from the very beginning, kind of the characteristics of it, and why it's been so problematic for just the world, on a grand, massive scale. So anyway, at the heart of it, what I really uncovered was that the feminists have been asking the wrong question, which is not how do we help women as women, but how do we help women become like men? So I think once you sort of start seeing that pattern emerge from certainly early feminism, but then later feminism, we can really see how we've gotten to the trans world,
right.
Why we can't define what a woman is, because we've really denigrated all of the maternal and feminine characteristics, and really in their place put masculine aspects and idolize that, I think, for women. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
And some of them, first wave, rooted in some of the revolutions, French Revolution, communism.
Yeah, so the grandmother of feminism is this woman named Mary Wollstonecraft. That's where people sort of start feminism as an ideology. Of course, the word is anachronistic because she didn't use the word. But so Mary Wollstonecraft is writing at the time of the French Revolution. She's an English woman who actually goes to France, and while she's there, she's exposed to all the radicalness of it. In fact, she had a relationship with an American man, and she ended up getting pregnant. They did not marry, but he told the embassy that they were married, and that's actually what saved her life. Otherwise, she probably would have had her, head roll at the guillotine, just the way that many of her friends did and whatnot. So she saw firsthand just the bloodiness of it, but she was still a defender of the Republic, and really a contemporary of Thomas Paine, who's writing at that time The Rights of Man, which is...
And she was a defender of the Republic.
Yeah, she remained...
Even losing friends at the guillotine.
Yeah, it was very much, and you have to remember this time what's going on is she's a very broken woman. She has these horrible parents, and they are her model of male and female, and she's seeing that there's women are really suffering, and women are suffering. I mean, there's no doubt about it, but people in general are also suffering too. It's not just women. But she's looking at these women and their fertility and the problems that it creates for them. And so it's sort of this, how do we help women avoid the problems associated with fertility? And so that the solution at that point, you've got Thomas Paine writing about this. You've got the Marquis de Sade. You've got this whole romantic movement going on in the Enlightenment that's trying to get rid of every taboo. That's trying to break down the church. It's trying to break down, all of these structures that's, been upholding society, and really get rid of them and recreate something new. And so that's what the spirit within which she's writing. And so she's focused on this idea of how do we kind of collapse society into this very egalitarian kind of no differences between men and women. And, there's certain things that she says that are actually good. I mean, she focuses a lot on male chastity and women being virtuous, and she's critical of the ways in which women can be flighty and vain and, all those kinds of things. But again, I think she had the wrong medicine for the illness. And so it's her ideas that sort of got picked up and run with later on.
And it does seem, like childbearing makes a woman vulnerable, dependent, And it seems like a lot of these feminists want to escape that. It's just so much written into the, not only biology, but the psychology, right? And I would, even to me, like the spiritual gifts of women that come to bear in motherhood, and even, you know, ability to suffer, the long suffering and things.
Yeah.
So, and that's what I keep thinking of too. It's like women have these, men and women have their unique gifts and complementary. And it's like the women gifts, to me, they tend to often be more of the spiritual realm or the virtues related therein. And so that's getting trampled by, that's being cut off, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and that's what one of the most surprising and interesting factors that I found was the Mary Wollstonecraft's son-in-law, whom she never met. She died when she, shortly after giving birth to Mary Godwin, later Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, this family is just amazing how what their reach was. But so Mary Godwin ends up falling in love with Percy Shelley, who's the romantic poet, and the two of them run away together, along with Mary's stepsister, Jane, who calls herself Jane. She later changes her name to Claire, so it gets a little confusing. But in any event, the three of them run away, and you know, there's all this just mayhem that ensues because Percy Shelley's already married. His wife's expecting their second child. He's this very well-off young man. He gets thrown out of Oxford because he wrote something on atheism, and his whole life is really trying to, again, destroy taboos. So in his writing, he actually writes about this woman named Sithna. And Sithna is the first woman in literature that does not have a husband and doesn't have children. There's no motherhood. And she becomes this idol of this notion of the independent woman. So while Mary Shelley's writing about Frankenstein and his creature, Percy Shelley is writing about, and they of course later married after Percy Shelley's wife committed suicide. His first wife committed suicide. Wow. Anyway, their whole lives, I mean, people see this in the book. I lay out some of it, but were really just a mess because he was so, both Percy Shelley and then Mary Godwin's family, her father, William Godwin, who was married to Mary Wollstonecraft, was very much a proponent of free love. So this whole free love notion just destroys all of these people, and there's so many, children that die from it. But the big thing, aside from these biographical details, is just really this idea that Percy Shelley plants of this independent woman who doesn't have a husband, doesn't have children, and that's really what started resonating with people. Yeah. And you see this throughout the 1800s, becoming, kind of growing in steam. And of course, that you match it up with communism, and suddenly it just becomes explosive in the second wave, for sure.
Yeah. I've wondered, why, the marriage to free love. I mean, I think we're seeing that with the transgender movement now. Mm-hmm. It's like these quote unquote sexual values are just preeminent above all things. Even like the Sound of Freedom thing with the human trafficking before the scandal with Tim Ballard and all this. But I was wondering, I thought we could all agree on this point, right? Sex trafficking. Right. I thought this could be.
Isn't this just like the lowest of the low? Yeah. Why is this contentious? Yeah.
But I wonder if it was just, don't let anything get in the way of whatever I want to do sexually.
Yeah. And that's the big piece, is the will. I mean, it goes back to Nietzsche, which I don't talk about Nietzsche in the book, partially because I wanted this book to be very readable. I didn't want people to get bogged down too much in philosophy and feel like it was an academic book. So I tried to keep it light. But it is that idea of this will to power, that I can will to be whomever I want. I can reinvent myself. And so you see that's in Nietzsche, and then it moves on with Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. And it just keeps going. And then you see someone like Kate Millett, who, she's in the 60s and 70s, and she's the same spirit of, how do we get rid of every taboo, and, really saying amazing and bombastic things, and, it's the audacious life. I mean, that was what her life was characterized by, and she was very much incredibly influential in pushing forward the feminist movement and the gay and lesbian movement, and of course, what has flown out of that is the trans movement. So, it's really just this idea of these taboos are enslaving us, and we have to break them all down. And without paying attention to the real carnage that comes from them.
And I mean, I guess would the feminists say, like, well, if you look at just historically, women are suffering, many are dying in childbirth, and, the difficulties and the sacrificial love they're called to, and they're trying to get away from that, I guess, on one level. But I guess, does it express itself differently in men? I see, like, men, well, yeah, we want a sexual revolution. We want unlimited promiscuity.
Right.
Now, so they're doing their damage, but the women's damage is different, isn't it? What their approach or their...
Well, I mean, the women's damage is different because we have 60 million dead children through abortion. This is, and I think this is the hardest part about this topic in general, is that I think people in their mind separate out abortion and the feminist movement. They think of them as sort of two different realities and don't see that they're actually tightly connected. And I think in the future people will say, feminism was the most deadly ideology in all the 21st century. The numbers are just off the charts. If you look at even globally, there's about 10 million more abortions worldwide than there are people dying of everything else combined. It's something like last year was something like 64 million people died in total, and there were something like 74 million abortions worldwide. So
it's the leading cause of death in the world.
Yeah, it is.
And people don't. I would say that at pro-life marches and stuff, but we don't. Do we realize it's the leading cause of death?
Yes, and it all came about because of what the feminist movement did. Again, back to this idea of the independent woman. It articulated in very compelling and attractive ways this idea of a woman being enslaved by a husband and children. So rather than a husband and children being an avenue through which she finds her happiness or finds holiness or lives a virtuous and beautiful life, those are the things that she now has to fight against. And this is why abortion's so vital, because women have to be, in the feminist vision, women have to be like men. So abortion and contraception are the ways through which we must have those things according to the ideology. So I think putting all these pieces together, I think, helps people really realize the gravity of it and just how evil it really is, instead of separating them out and feeling like, oh, okay, feminism has been sort of this, benevolent grandmother that just means I'm pro-woman. Well, it has all of this incredible baggage that I think most people don't begin to realize. And of course, part of that is, I mentioned free love already. I mentioned the idea of collapsing society down into this egalitarian terms. But there's also the occult, which is very, very much part of it. Percy Shelley was involved with the occult. We move on to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, hugely involved in seances and the mediums and the rappings that are happening during the Second Great Awakening in the United States. So all of that is a part of it.
Good. And Stanton, what was the good part of her work? Wasn't there something good about her?
Wasn't there something good about her? Well, I mean, that's the big question. I'm not actually convinced that there is much that was really good about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton comes about, she gets this idea from this table called the Spirit Table. It's now in the Smithsonian, for the Seneca Falls Convention. But that's usually what people associate her with, and this being the founders of the suffrage movement in the United States. So the problem, though, is that she's getting her ideas through mediums and seances, and very involved in the occult. She also has, there's the Seneca Falls document that she put together, but she actually couldn't put it together by herself because she wasn't a middle-class woman. She was an upper-class woman. She actually had to ask her husband and other friends that were lawyers about, well, what would be the grievances of women today? It wasn't like she had these grievances that she was operating with, and how do we correct them? It was the opposite. It was, we want to do this convention to help women, but what should the grievances be? And, and there's valid things like, women not getting custody of children during divorces and whatnot. But it's really interesting to look at this list of the grievances that they came up with in the Seneca Falls Convention, because you can actually see the pendulum swing the opposite direction. They're talking about the capacity of women to have custody of their children, such kind, work and whatnot. But if you see what's happened with men don't have any custody of their children. Men don't, or very rarely get custody of their children. The default is always to give it to the child to the woman. Men have no say over abortion. So you can see kind of the pendulum swinging the other direction, which is, of course, this reminder, like, we're made to be in families. We're made to live in families. We're not made to have this being parsed out and this idea of this, radical individualism of the male or the female. So anyway, she's an interesting character, but I think she's really made to appear to be a heroine by the feminist movement without really realizing the damage that she did. And she's got this book called The Women's Bible that's actually... It's still in print. I mean, you can still find it. And, she's so involved in theosophy and the occult and the women's movement, this idea of this women's revolution, that she can't really read it. It's almost like an angry adolescent sort of picking things, from the Old Testament. Anytime a woman is mentioned, there's sort of these juvenile comments about Abraham and Sarah. And, it's really bad. But ultimately, she gets kicked out of her own movement. The organization that she founded. She also was racist, very racist. This was another, there's all this drama that it's like, why is this not ever coming up? But she was very upset that the slaves that were being freed, the men were getting the right to vote before she was. And this is what she's, another thing she's railing against. So she finally gets kicked out of her own movement and stops suffrage from happening because of all the scandals associated with her for another 30 years.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, there's a lot of dirt on Elizabeth Cady Stanton that isn't well known, unfortunately.
Some of the things that caught my eye last year or two, it just seemed like there's a bigger movement in the U.S., certainly for socialism and wanting bigger government to take care of things. But even among like Catholic feminist writers or something, you're starting to hear more of that. I think you talk about the egalitarian, this want of egalitarian, and I think obviously capitalism has its faults, and it needs to be moderated and humanized, and you need to take care of the least and the suffering and things. But I look at it as like, one, that if you want to have a healthy economy, you have to have some element of it. If there's the laws of economics, right? But two, someone pointed out to me recently that struck me, like, it protects private property, which is absolutely fundamental to natural law and the social doctrine of the church. Yeah. And that's when I started getting a little worried here about, where are we going with all this?
Right.
And,
Yeah.
So.
No, and I think those are incredibly valid concerns, especially when you start seeing a lot of the motivations. The driver's not only capitalism and money. It's a lot of it is actually communism that has driven this. And this is it. If you look at the Soviet Union, what do? Well, the children are raised by the state. The parents both go to work. They're trying to create ideal workers, and so you can see this echoing in the work of Betty Friedan. This is another shocking thing, is what a communist Betty Friedan was, and her whole goal was to get women out of the home. She called it the comfortable concentration camp. And she's quoting Engels in different ways and talking about how women will only be free when they're doing productive work outside the home. So raising children and having children wasn't considered production under the communist system. The Marxists didn't think so. So she's promoting this idea of getting women out of the home. And she just does it amazingly well because, of course, prior to that, in China, or after that, actually, I guess in China, but in the Soviet Union and other countries, it's done through usually military force. And I think that the new left Marxists in the United States, people like Marcuse and Wilhelm Reich and others that were very influential in the 30s and 40s and 50s, they saw that you couldn't do that in the United States. You had to get into the culture. And this is where the sexual revolution comes into play. Wilhelm Reich, he's this Frankfurt thinker. He comes to work at Columbia University. He's written this book in 1936 called The Sexual Revolution, which was really the blueprint for what happened in the 60s, was all these leftist ideas of how do we destroy the culture? How do we get women to be these ideal workers? Because they wanted to usher in this sort of new revolution. So anyway, so I think that the impulse that we're seeing, you have to sort of look at what's motivating it with women, especially the language. Are they using the word mothers. Do they want sex blindness, where you can't tell the difference in a workplace, or you're not supposed to see the difference between a male and a female? All of these kinds of ways in which men and women are sort of collapsed down into cogs. That's not from capitalism. That's from communism. So I think that that's an important thing that people just need to be aware of, is that it's communism that's trying to make us these ideal workers. I think the communists didn't really think about, like, well, what happens when all these workers get all this money, because they're also trying to crush our economy and not have women spend so much money. But women at that point were, 70% of the purchasing power was through them. They still are, and they just didn't really think through. Wow. What happens when women now have 2 jobs and they have a lot, or a couple has 2 jobs, and there's more money, So it looks like it's just capitalism, but really, I think the underpinning is communist, Marxist.
Yeah, and to me, it's like just like capitalism champions private property, which we're talking about subsidiarity and running a home, making your own decisions. It's like, I mean, that frightens me to want to hand that to the government, And that's what has happened to women by and large. I mean, there's this whole, I don't know if you remember Julia, this woman that the Obama administration cooked up in their marketing materials around the time they were coming up with Obamacare. It was this woman who didn't ever need a man in her life. She didn't need a father. She had the government. She didn't need a husband. She didn't need, the government was going to take care of her through her whole life. And that's what we have, especially among poor women, is this idea of bureaugamy. It's this great word the sociologist named Lionel Tiger came up with. He's also the one that came up with male bonding, that idea of male bonding. But that's what's happened to the poor women in the culture, is they are now married to the government. They don't have any ambitions that they would actually ever get married. Like, marriage is something of a status symbol at this point. You have to be a certain kind of woman with a certain kind of wealth, and most of our poor don't have it. So this is why we see this, fraying and this, awful reality in which these women find themselves, that they will never get out of, because the government is the one that's both promoting and perpetuating their problems. Yeah, I mean, it seemed like on the other side, we see like these powerful corporations growing and their social agenda. And I've heard people point out that they're like growing on like the destabilization of culture. Like if the family's broken, they're more dependent on corporations. They get more consumeristic. They want to buy stuff. They want more entertainments or whatever. And that's not new either. I mean, that's actually, it's been going on. In my research, I found, magazines actually would focus on that. If we have broken women, we sell them more products. They need us more. So it was a very concerted effort to try and destabilize women and make them more dependent upon the state and more dependent upon products. Even just all the body imaging that women have been told, you have to look like this kind of body. Much of that was to promote the profits, really, from diets and exercise fads and clothing and all of those kinds of things. So it's really ugly when you start seeing just the ways in which we have been incredibly manipulated by all of this to get us to think that these are things that are good for us. So it's scary. Well, why don't we talk about the positive side of it? Maybe what things are good for us? Where is human Flourishing found? And maybe like what's the real power, if that's the right word, of women? What do they bring to bear in society for force for good and things? I think those are great questions. My last chapter of the book really goes into the question about women and what does it mean to be a woman? How do we define woman? And obviously there's the Matt Walsh definition. She's an adult female human. But it's really unsatisfying. It just feels very sort of textbooky and doesn't put flesh. It doesn't put any flesh on anything. It doesn't help us. And this is actually, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we face as Catholics, is that the left has done both an amazing job of making feminism incredibly attractive. It's attractive, well-spoken women. They're all in it together, saying the exact same thing. It's very, very hard to find someone that will not go with them in lockstep. They have also, though, been very effective in articulating what they think the opposition looks like. So, The Handmaid's Tale, you've got the red bonnets and the red robes. Like, this is to imply that those of us that don't agree with them are,
heading into some kind of fertility cult, or so that's part of it, what they've painted. But they've also just put out there this idea that unless you're a feminist, it goes along with them, you're a doormat, or something like that. So
you're missing out. Right?
Yeah. So our job really is to sort of help women start figuring out how to think about women again. It's this grammar that's completely missing. We don't have mental hooks for it. We don't know women like this. We probably know women in our personal lives like this, but we don't see them anywhere in the culture. And this is one of the things that my colleague Noelle Mering and I have done with our books, Theology of Home, is to try to give visuals and re-articulate what does it mean to be a woman in the flesh, and the beauty of it and whatnot. But aside from that, I go into the end of this book just looking at, what do women do? I mean, the first piece is, of course, we have to talk about motherhood and mothering. We're not just, and I don't just mean that biologically. I think all women are called to mother others. And mothering, by that I mean providing a place where people are sheltered, are nourished, are protected to become who it is that God made them to be. So I think that's the real challenge, is we've sort of made motherhood look like it's just for biological mothering, when in fact it's also meant to be psychological and spiritual. So that I think needs to kind of be a reframing of the discussion, which can feel incredibly uncomfortable because it feels taboo to talk about women and motherhood anymore. They've made it sound like it's something like getting, it's like getting a driver's license. You can become a mother or not, instead of the reality that we have this heart for mothering. And you can see it. We have clear proof that the mothering heart doesn't go away. Look at what's happened with pets. $700 million is being spent on pet Halloween costumes in our country alone.
On costumes?
Just costumes.
Oh, for the pet.
For the pet. Yeah. Okay. The animals get costumes at Halloween. $700 million. And I keep watching this number go up. I first ran across it a couple of years ago, and it was only it was only 500 billion. It's only $500 million. Now it's up to 700 million. So that women have this heart that they want to mother others. What happens when you take away children and what grandchildren, it's got to express itself somehow. And this is why we see pet strollers and, on and on. So I think that there's great hope, because that hasn't been crushed out of us. It's still alive. But yeah, I think we just have to start finding new ways to talk about it, and to give women a sense that there's something else out there than what they get from the mainstream everything.
Is there a favorite book you have that talks about motherhood, that describes it in a beautiful way or something?
I think that's a good question. The hard part about a lot of the discussion about women and motherhood is it feels very dated. So it's a kind of thing that I can imagine. There are many women that I can point to. Gertrude von Lefort, and obviously Alice von Hildebrand and others, but they're not the kind of things that I would just give to any woman,
Right.
And I think that that's the challenge. And that's one of the things I wanted to do with this book, was make it feel very accessible, that anybody could read it, and they might hate it, but they would plant seeds in a certain way, versus a lot of the books that are out there on this topic feel either really, they're very academic. There's a lot of language and jargon that prevents people from just entering into it. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I never wanted to work on women's issues. When I was a graduate student, I think I said out loud,
women are complicated. That's what I was.
Oh my goodness, so complicated. But there's a way in which women absorb content that I don't think that as Catholics we've done a great job of paying attention to either. We don't have women's magazines. We don't have TV shows that really mimic what's the left is doing. I mean, this is how the left has destroyed us. Magazines, daytime TV show. Think of like the damage Oprah Winfrey has done. And we don't recognize that. I think we think of it as really fluff. Instead of saying like, no, they're actually passing along their awful ideas through, it's
Right.
like the Barbie movie. I mean, Barbie
Right.
is a perfect example of this.
Right.
Pink, nostalgia, great clothes, a few tender moments, but what is that movie full of? Totally unnecessary men.
Right.
Men are idiots, and if they try to take over, the women need to just take it back and put them back in their place. And that's the message.
Seems like it comes right out of the Garden of Eden, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And that's actually the amazing thing, is to see that both Percy Shelley and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were very much part of this group of thinking that Eve was framed, that idea of, or Eve was actually provided an opportunity by the serpent. She has this, knowledge, that special knowledge that came from the serpent. So there's a rewriting of Genesis because they don't like the original one. They're trying to go back and rewrite it in a way that fits with their own narrative. So.
And there's like a weakness of men there. Some describe like a lack of backbone or something that they become passive.
It's
like
kryptonite. Feminism has been kryptonite for men. I mean, really, I think you can just hear, like I'll bring up feminism and you can just sort of hear the beep, beep, beep. Men are backing away. And I don't blame them. I mean, men don't want to argue with women. But actually I talk about this in the book. Jordan Peterson mentions in one of his conversations with Camille Paglia is saying, well, men really need to step in and start doing something. And Jordan Peterson says, you don't really know what you're saying because men have sort of these laws of engagement. They know what to do with another man if things get really tense and awkward and confrontational. Sometimes it can lead to raised voices or fists being thrown. But a good man will never do that with a woman. So he's sort of frozen, like he doesn't know how to respond in that kind of argumentative situation because women are incredibly aggressive and the way that feminism has shaped us and formed us. So I think that's a real problem, and I think this is one of the reasons why the best thing that men can do is actually become better men. And I think in some ways my book is helping in small ways because it's helping men understand that they need to feel compassion towards women instead of resentment. Because much of what we have been fed has been total indoctrination. Most of us didn't choose to be feminists. It was all, it was from the very beginning. I remember being first, second grade and being taught to compete with the boys. It's just been part of the way in which we've been raised. And so I think that that's an important thing for men to understand. There needs to be a layer of compassion towards women for our bad behavior. But I think men need to be better men. And that's the way in which they fight this. But I think more importantly, women need to be more outspoken and recognize this has been horrible for women. It's been horrible for the family. It's been, there's not a single metric that shows that women are happier because of this. Depression rates, suicide, all of these things show women are miserable. So I think it's got to be, I think women need to step up and do more for sure.
Now, sometimes it's helped me, maybe with frustration with feminism and stuff, but just to remember, I think a devotion to the Blessed Mother. I think for men, if they have that, it's like, the Blessed Mother is a woman. Would you treat her this way? Would you have this attitude? You can see something of her in women that is very inspiring to men. But and I wanted to say too, I think that's a great, championing motherhood, spiritual, biological motherhood. And the one thing I marvel at, I think, as a man is, the woman's capacity and drive to pay attention to the individual. It's like men can get caught up in ideology or big ideas and all this, and we lose sight of the individual. But it's like I see women, even the political sphere, they just come crashing through all that and say, yeah, but this person needs help or they're suffering, and what are we doing about this? These ideas are great or whatever. You don't want to violate this or something.
Back down to the practical.
Yeah.
No, I think that's, I love that idea of, that's the beauty of the Blessed Mother. What a gift she is. That even in our own age where her image is being radically erased from the culture, and they're twin prongs. The feminist movement has targeted virginity and motherhood. We have the Virgin Mother, it's her that they're trying to rub out of us fundamentally. But that's the model that I think we all need to really be mindful of and focus on and have that devotion to her so that she can show us, what true womanhood is supposed to look like and get us to that point.
Yeah, and I had, last few years, I had an experience of the Blessed Mother, the strength of her, which I usually didn't think of her that way, and I went to Our Lady of Champion up in Wisconsin.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and I went to the lower church, the original chapel. Just had this great experience of the tenderness of Our Lady. It was just something palpable. I go to Yasna Gora, and I prayed the rosary in front of Our Lady of Czestochowa image. And I remember I just felt the strength of Our Lady, that it was this has been the place where the Polish people have derived strength to persevere through all their tragedies of their history.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes, I would guess a lot of women, maybe they know it better than I do, but they think, well, this devotion is 1950s, it's dated, but she's standing at the foot of the cross. I mean, our women today, you got to be strong. Well, look to the Blessed Mother. I mean, she's a source of strength.
Yeah. No, and I think that is important. I think I love the idea of her tenderness. I've recently started praying more specifically daily to Our Lady Mother of Tenderness, because that's the piece that's missing. That's what they've stripped from us, is this idea that we can be tender, and this, even the recognition of the vulnerability that happens when we are pregnant and when we are giving life. It's there's a lot of power in that too, in that capacity, and that's where, again, you see the family is so vital, because a woman cannot do all those things on her own that she needs to do to take care of a family. I mean, women do it all the time, and it's incredibly hard. I have incredible sympathy for women that have to do that. But the reality is, it's not part of God's plan. We need men to be men, to fill in and to allow us that space to be vulnerable, so that we can be good mothers, we can raise our children. And that working together, I think, gets mixed up and messed up, because we're so focused on men versus women and all that tension, without really realizing that complementarity of gifts, and being focused on that, and how each has its own place in that real dynamic of family life.
And it's still, even in our movies, even with all the liberalness of Hollywood, it's like they still want a guy to bust in, rescue you,
Right.
There's still that.
Those things don't change. Unless you're watching Barbie, and then, of course, none of that is allowed. But it is amazing how these archetypes are built deeply into us. And, it's just that incredible audacity, really, of the culture and of the left to try and tell us that they aren't. Especially with, they have that, there's this word called essentialism, where you can't actually say that a body and soul are sort of connected, that the body informs us about what's the person is like. And it's amazing what a taboo word that has become. That's essentialism. But they've just been incredibly effective in trending things in the way in which they want them to be trended and become taboo.
Last question. I know we're out of time. I know you've told the story before about your own, like, wanting to get married and even embracing like a more tender side.
Oh, yeah.
How would you describe that again? Because I feel like I come upon that as a priest, like someone woman to get married.
Right.
And I want to help them, but I don't know how to tell them.
Right. How do I say this nicely? Like, calm down, stop it. I was very much a part of the culture of feminism and ambition, and you're fed these things your whole life, and I had this deep conversion back to Catholicism. I was very lukewarm for most of my life, but when I was in college, but there was still certain pieces that I just couldn't figure out. I was doing a doctorate in philosophy in Washington, D.C., and working at a think tank, and doing all the things that on paper look like this is what a woman should be doing. Right. But a lot of it, I actually, what really precipitated was that several of my ex-boyfriends went on to marry kindergarten teachers. And I just was scratching my head at that. Like, what is it that the kindergarten teacher has that I don't have? I'm like, here's my list. I'm checking all the right boxes. And then finally, it just, something just started hitting me. Like, it's kindness, it's tenderness, it's listening, it's, being present. It's, all those things that I had never really thought about before, cultivated the virtues in. And, not feeling like I always had to have a snappy, smart answer, but listening more and smiling more, all those little things. Yeah. I started doing them, and it was really. I even changed the way that I dressed a little bit. It was fewer, like the pantsuits and things like that. It was more
feminine type.
Yeah, just more feminine. And anyway, it was great. One day I was in the metro. It was a hot summer day, but down the metro it was obviously cooler, and I had this young man walk up to me, and he said, "Are you a kindergarten teacher?" And Anyway, I knew that I had triumphed. I had finally achieved something, and I never saw him again. I just smiled and said no and walked off. It was the end of the encounter, but it was sort of my sign, like that I had transformed myself sufficiently. And I can see now too, when both as a wife and mother, just how vital these things are in terms of just how much more important listening is and being present, because your children and your spouses are going to have problems that the fighting spirit and the ambition cannot bust through. You can't talk them out of it. You can't, you just have to be present and listen and hold them and all of that. And those are incredibly powerful tools that I think are hard to put on a resume, but that go so far in terms of cultivating souls and loving people the way in which they need to be loved.
My whole life, I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, a very big engineering town, high tech. Went to engineering school, mostly men. Went to seminary, men. Went to religious life, all men. It's like I'm not dazzled by women with male attributes or something.
Right.
I'm taken by this ability to pay attention to the individual, this tenderness, kindness, and that's what the world needs a lot right now. So.
A lot of it, yeah. No, I think a little goes a long way too, so that's a nice thing.
Well, thank you so much, Carrie, for talking with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.